So there's currently a thread on AudioScienceReview titled PEQdB Diamond Target Curve New Stanford White Paper, and since I'm banned from AudioScienceReview, I can't respond to any of the criticisms directly on the site, but since I have a YouTube channel, I thought, why not just make a YouTube video directly responding to any of these supposed criticisms. So in his initial post, Toddy actually posted the wrong paper. This is the comparative evaluation of headphone target curves paper, where the PEQdB in-ear target curve and the PEQdB over-ear target curve, the old target curves, were compared against several other target curves, including Hi-Fi Endgame's target curve. PEQdB Ultra or PEQdB Diamond were not featured in this paper. And this person, Chagall, was saying, I've tried it and liked it at first, but after a couple of days, I found the tuning to be somewhat gimmicky. He's referring to the PEQdB Ultra target curve. I don't think he's actually listened to the PEQdB Diamond target curve, and he's saying that Harman over-ear 2018 is the more robust starting point. And it's kind of funny because I spoke to Sean Olive about this, and even he said that the Harman targets were dull in the highs, and this makes sense because the head-related transfer function they started off with is a lot more rolled off past 10 kilohertz compared to the diffuse field head-related transfer function of 47 individuals on average from Hammershoy and Mahler's data. Okay, so a bunch of random stuff here. Okay, now he has posted the right paper, which refers to PEQdB Diamond target curve. And we can see Apples here, who's actually Hi-Fi ASMR or Novrat. We can see his post history. He doesn't really know that much about audio, so he had to make a post asking for speaker recommendations because he's not knowledgeable enough to figure out what speakers are good by himself. So he has to ask for speaker recommendations and how to pick amplifiers and speakers, even though the stuff is really easy for someone that's good at audio, such as myself. But, you know, we can't really expect more of Hi-Fi ASMR. Let's just read this for the lulz. Help me understand speakers. I was dead set on getting Neumann speakers because of their low noise. I want desktop speakers, but I hear most active speakers will have self-noise, which I'd like to avoid. I mainly want clear treble since most cheap speakers I've had on my desk seem to be mid-range focused, so a good tweeter, I guess. I couldn't find anything besides Neumann speakers being ultra-low noise. I then came across the term passive speakers, which some seem to measure good and have no noise since the amp is external. What are some good, cheap, and small desktop computer speakers with good treble and no audible hiss, or other problems like turning off randomly? I'm kind of interested in coaxial speakers. I'd like to maybe spend less than 1,000 for the speakers and then maybe a few hundred for an amp if it's passive. I may just get the Neumanns, but I'd like to hear about other things. Yeah, I mean, this guy really just does not know that much about audio, so has to ask these super basic questions on Audio Science Review and yeah, pretend he's not on an alt account. But I saw him like viewing this thread earlier about biodynamic DT990 ear pads and which third-party pads don't change the response. Like, this guy's absolutely obsessed with the biodynamic DT990 despite them having a really poor out-of-the-box response and highly variable frequency response with pad wear and extremely high low-frequency distortion. So he says his target is nulls, which is Harman with overly bright treble. The treble to bass balance is off, sounds thin from Harman 200 Hz mud scoop, then the overly bright treble makes the bass to treble balance off. It's fine if you like it, but I think it's fine with more mid-bass warmth. No need to worship him, it's not that special. Okay, tell me what recordings you're actually listening to come to these conclusions, because if you're listening to your Neumann TLM 103 recordings, this is not a valid argument because the Neumann TLM 103 is really boosted in the high frequencies with a resonance peak at around 13 kilohertz because the large diaphragm is not able to capture small wavelengths as accurately as a small diaphragm. As I've said previously, a 17 millimeter diameter diaphragm is the maximum diaphragm size you can have for accurate capture up to 20 kilohertz. And yeah, the TLM 103 is really boosted in the high frequencies, and if you're far away, the low frequencies are going to get rolled off. There's no way you can accurately listen to a TLM 103 recording and have a reference for reality because the microphone does not capture reality like the MKH8020 does. Listen to my Sennheiser MKH8020 recordings with the PEQdB Diamond target curve if you want to get an accurate appraisal for how this target curve sounds. Okay, and then he says he did a shootout and people chose his target curve over others. It is funny when some targets in the community get destroyed in the shootouts that people vote for on his website, but there is a suspicious pattern that every target he makes gets top rated over everything, especially when they have been wildly different. And this is very easy to debunk. In the first PEQdB white paper, we talked about how we created this target curve with some Bayesian statistic method, and it was called the PEQdB in-ear and PEQdB over-ear target curve, and we went over the methodology, but because there were several flaws in this methodology, including the constraints for the bass and treble limits as well as the ear gain limits, the target curve didn't actually end up being that good, which in the second PEQdB white paper, Comparative Evaluation of Headphone Target Curves Using Virtual Listening Tests, hi-fi endgame's target curve was preferred to the PEQdB in-ear target curve and the PEQdB over-ear target curve in both of the listening tests. In the in-ear listening test, the hi-fi endgame target curve was preferred over the PEQdB in-ear target curve, and in the over-ear listening test, the hi-fi endgame target was preferred over the PEQdB over-ear target curve. So claiming that every PEQdB target curve has been the best is completely false when your target curve literally beat the original PEQdB target curves in our listening tests. And in the third PEQdB paper, it was discussed how the PEQdB Ultra target curve is derived. We used the hi-fi endgame target as a starting point and let listeners adjust the gain for the bass boost, the ear gain peaking filter, and a high shell filter. And listeners basically ended up preferring more high frequencies versus the hi-fi endgame target in that 3-parameter method of adjustment listening test, showing that the hi-fi endgame target was likely a really good starting point to begin with. Then we have listeners spouting a bunch of nonsense like, there's a basic assumption we all make for any researcher undertaking a scientific endeavor, the assumption of good faith and honesty in reporting results. In my opinion, we cannot extend this assumption to Shar given his history of pathological dishonesty. He has contradicted himself, spouted misinformation, and lied so consistently over such a long time period that it's impossible to trust anything he says or does. How are we supposed to know he hasn't manipulated results or otherwise conducted the studies in a manner unbefitting of an unbiased scientific endeavor? We can't, because he has a years-long history of being a dishonest troll who's perfectly happy to say complete bullshit just despite others, so no one should take him seriously. Clearly he wasn't thinking when he was skulking around the internet, perpetuating outright falsehoods and saying demonstrably false things. I'm sure if he knew back then that people would remember his poor behavior and that would mean it was virtually impossible to take any of his scientific endeavors seriously, he'd have thought twice about making his whole online persona edgy, overconfident jerk. No thanks, listener. I don't really care about your advice. A few years ago, when I first started making these YouTube videos, the Headphone Show was basically running around talking about DACs and amps. Even listener on these Discords was acting like frequency response did not matter at all. It was me bashing into these people's heads that DACs and amps don't matter as much as they think. Frequency response is everything. And even the whole diffuse field plus tilt thing came from me bashing it into their head that this was how sound is supposed to be. And now I realize that diffuse field plus tilt is completely wrong for headphones because there's no reverberation when you're listening to headphones. So the playing field is completely different and diffuse field plus tilt makes no sense for that reason. But to claim that you didn't just outright copy me on so many of these things you guys are now perpetuating on the Headphone Show is just ridiculous. In a few years, you might go around saying that some target curve, which basically measures exactly the same as the PEQdB Diamond target curve, is the best target curve, and that I still never knew anything about what I was talking about. And perhaps at that time I would have created an even better target curve than the PEQdB Diamond target curve, and then you would be like, oh my god, there's no proof that this new target curve is better or something. And it's like, you're always stuck in the past and are never at the cutting edge of audio science because you just are not that intelligent. And I mean, what are your credentials? You have none. I have a master's degree in audio science from Stanford University. Honestly, you're just a joke, listener. Okay, so Chagall says, looks like a typical showroom tuning, big bass and sparkly highs. Sounds impressive in a quick demo, so no wonder it wins. Again, PEQdB Ultra was an old target curve of ours. In the third PEQdB white paper, the methodology for the 3-square method of adjustment listening test was detailed. We have 6 variable parameters. Listeners are able to adjust the center frequency and gain for 3 different filters, a low shelf filter, a peaking filter, and a high shelf filter. And in this listening test, it was found that listeners preferred a lower bass shelf frequency, and otherwise the target was very similar to the PEQdB Ultra target curve. And the lower bass shelf frequency makes perfect sense when you consider that in Harman's research, they let listeners adjust the bass shelf frequency and gain for the in-ear listening tests, and they found that this was basically the result for the preferred low frequency response. And it makes perfect sense that using a similar method of adjustment approach, PEQdB gets the same result in the bass for the PEQdB Diamond target curve. And the superior high frequency extension is due to the better HRTF used, the diffuse field head-related transfer function, with superior high-frequency extension to the Harman flat in-room target curve, which was detailed in Sean Olive's 2013 paper of listener preferences for in-room loudspeaker and headphone target responses. And here we go with Hi-Fi ASMR saying that this target curve is basically just nulls with the 10 kilohertz filled in. And I mean, this is not exactly wrong. Nulls had a very sharp 16 kilohertz peaking filter, and it just didn't sound right in the high frequencies. And PEQdB basically fills in this region and addresses all of the issues in the null's target curve. And to claim that PEQdB Diamond target curve is too bright and thin doesn't make any sense when the 6 variable parameters we used let listeners adjust the bass boost, frequency, gain, the ear gain, peaking filter, frequency and gain, and the high shelf filter, frequency and gain. So this is a very optimized target curve. The next PEQdB listening test will be released eventually, and the target curve from that will be superior to the PEQdB Diamond target curve because the methodology will be better. But for now, PEQdB Diamond target curve is the most scientifically robust headphone target curve. And now we have someone saying that they bought the Samsung EO IA500 and that they can hear a sine sweep from 20 Hz up to 13 kilohertz and up to 14.5 kilohertz if they turn the volume up. So clearly this person doesn't have very good hearing and they're not actually able to hear high frequencies that well. So when he's saying that he doesn't understand the technical superiority of this versus a single dynamic driver IEM, we know why, because you can't actually hear the high frequencies that well. But if we actually look at the measurements of the AKG EO IG955 with SpinFit W1 ear tips versus the Truth Ear X Critical Zero Red, for example, this is a very popular earphone on AudioScienceReview due to its low distortion, we can see that after the resonance peak at 8 kilohertz, the AKG EO IG955 continues extending all the way to at least 15 kilohertz, whereas the Zero Red has a massive dip in the high frequencies followed by a peak at around 13 kilohertz because the low performance of this dynamic driver used for the high frequencies is degrading the high frequency response. Coming from Eddymodic, I'm not the least bothered by occlusion effect. I don't really understand this comment because Eddymodic does not have much occlusion effect. That's the entire point, essentially. Like, the design is a small cylinder such that you put it in your ear and essentially sound is able to escape around the cylinder of the earphone. And yeah, the Eddymodic earphones do not have much occlusion effect, so obviously you should not be bothered by occlusion effect when you're wearing them. But he says he's not sure why having no occlusion effect is going to make the sound superior. Companies like Sony, Apple, Meta, Bose, Valve already know this, but a lack of occlusion effect is a prerequisite for accurate binaural rendering. And these companies go to great lengths to mitigate the occlusion effect, whether it's through open ear designs with Valve's latest headphone or typical active noise cancellation or transparency mode approaches, which include having a microphone which captures sounds emanating from within the ear canal and then sending a cancellation wave back into the ear canal such that there's no perceived occlusion effect. So yeah, if you want reduced ambient noise, don't go for these high occlusion effect IEMs. Just get something from one of these flagship companies like Apple or Samsung with good active noise cancellation, and you can get a better perceived soundstage than with any of these passive closed back in-ear monitors with high occlusion effect. But yeah, that's everything on this thread for now. Maybe if more people respond to this with some other criticisms, I'll make another video, but I'll see you guys next time.